Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong online Zoom event series. I'm Ian Marlowe, a Bloomberg journalist and a correspondent governor here at the FCC in Hong Kong. We have a great conversation tonight, but first I just wanted to flag a couple of events and activities here at the FCC. We have a club lunch book talk coming up on September 28th. That's with journalist and author Mark O'Neill about his new book, China's Russian Princess, the Silent Wife of Chiang Ching-kuo. That is an in-person event, and it's one of the many events that we're having at the club nowadays because of the more relaxed COVID situation here. We recently hosted Hong Kong Executive Council member Regina Ip, which was a sold-out lunch, and as well as the SCMP's editorial cartoonist Harry Harrison, whose amazing cartoons are now on display in the historic main bar downstairs until September 30th, and that event is open to the public. And now on to tonight's event. As China's grown more assertive in recent years under Xi Jinping, the country's so-called wolf warrior diplomats have mirrored those changes with a more aggressive style of combative diplomacy. We are lucky tonight to host Peter Martin, the author of a fascinating new book, China's Civilian Army, The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. Peter, in addition to being a colleague of mine at Bloomberg, is a former China politics correspondent where he wrote extensively about Chinese foreign policy and US-China tensions. He also reported from Xinjiang and across the country. He's now based in Washington, where he is Bloomberg's defense policy and intelligence reporter. Today's conversation will be moderated by the very active FCC member and former FCC board member, Shibani Mahtani, who is the Southeast Asia and Hong Kong bureau chief for the Washington Post. Shibani, over to you.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you very much, Peter, for joining us. Good morning to you and good evening to everyone watching from Hong Kong. Very, very timely conversation and a very timely book here, Peter, that I understand that you just published in June, and really we could not have a better timing for this conversation, given all the interest in China's diplomacy and how its diplomats have been responding to events around the world every day. I think, it might be interesting to start by discussing the origins of the term wolf warrior. I don't think many people know the sort of background or the action movie that is referenced with that term, and I think it makes for really interesting context to begin our conversation.
Yeah, sure, and thanks so much for hosting me this morning. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So yeah, the wolf warrior phrase kind of stems from this 2017 action movie called Wolf Warrior 2, which is this kind of Rambo-like adventure story about a Chinese hero on the continent of Africa, fighting bad guys and defending and upholding Chinese interests. And it's a pretty terrible movie. But something about it kind of captured this moment in China in 2017 when, China's economy was stronger and larger than it had ever been. Xi Jinping was pushing the Belt and Road Initiative around the world, to open a military base in Djibouti, was militarizing islands in the South China Sea. And at the same time, there was this kind of opening and void as the Trump administration began picking fights with US allies and all of these kinds of things. And so it kind of captured this tone where there was a new appetite for China to step up and take a leadership role, and at the same time wouldn't countenance what it saw as long-standing attempts to bully it. And so I guess Wolf Warrior 2 as a movie kind of captured that mood. And as the Trump administration kind of progressed, Chinese diplomats also started to kind of channel that energy a little bit in the way that they communicated with the world, and the foreign press started to use this phrase wolf warrior diplomacy to describe their actions.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the Trump administration. I think the one thing that I found really interesting about your book is a lot of people sort of interpret this wolf warrior style of diplomacy or Chinese diplomacy as a reaction to Trump, but I think your book makes a really clear argument of a sort of quite linear, actually, style of diplomacy that sort of stems from, the place of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs within the larger sort of Communist Party system. Do you want to sort of talk about that a little bit more and sort of what you found through your research about the role of MOFA throughout the party's history and how that sort of evolved?
Yeah, so I think in some ways, wolf warrior tactics, although of course the label is new, but the tactics have kind of been baked into the way that the Chinese Foreign Ministry has done business ever since the Communist Revolution in 1949. And one of the reasons for that is that when the new communist government was set up in Beijing, China basically had no diplomats to speak of. There were a few nationalist government figures who stayed behind, and they were more or less completely excluded from the government, with the exception of a couple of minor advisory roles. And the idea was that this new state that was going to remake China in its own image needed a brand new slate of diplomats who are completely loyal to the party and capable of continuing what its leaders believed would be a struggle on the world stage. Just as they'd fought a bloody civil war for victory at home, they would now need to fight a kind of an opinion battle internationally in order to shore up support for the regime. And so China's first foreign minister, Zhou Enlai, came up with this idea that Chinese diplomats should think and act like the People's Liberation Army in civilian clothing, which meant, of course, that they would be unfailingly loyal to the Communist Party. They would show extraordinary discipline in following orders, and they would also develop what he called a fighting spirit whenever China's interests were challenged. And so over the years, that kind of fighting spirit was channeled in very positive directions to getting everyone on the same page for kind of charm offensives that won friends for the PRC, like in the 1950s and again in the 1990s. And at other times, when the system became increasingly inward looking and focused on ideology or the cult of personality of one leader, whether that was Mao Zedong or more recently Xi Jinping, then their behavior has tended to veer toward the aggressive side and the kind of wolf warrior tactics that we've all come to know and love so well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the kind of fascinating things is that is actually quite hard to pull off, right? To have this diplomatic corps that is quite loyal and quite sticking to the party line that way, because usually when you're outside your own country, you tend to see things, sometimes a little bit more clearly, or you get exposed to, more things. That there was a part in your book about the tailor in Vietnam, right? Who was referencing obviously the famine during the Great Leap Forward in the mainland, and referencing obviously that both of them knew that there was this huge famine, but they had to keep to the party line, right? Which was that everything was going great and so on. I mean, how do you think the party has throughout the decades managed to actually foster that compliance, right? And that sort of civilian army sort of mentality from its foot soldiers overseas as well?
Yeah, I mean, so it's been a sort of continual challenge, and and as you noted, it's kind of a unique challenge for the PRC in that China has this strong need to communicate with the outside world and to win friends and influence, but it also it is constantly on guard against any outside efforts to undermine CCP rule, and wants to jealously guard against foreign influence at home. And so Chinese diplomats have always kind of had to walk this very, very careful tightrope as they've dealt with the outside world. And they developed actually in the very early years at the ministry a whole series of ways that they would cope with that challenge. One of them was the use of the buddy system, which in Chinese is called 二人同行, 2 people move together. And so the idea is that if you go out and you meet with a foreign counterpart, someone else from the ministry will accompany you to make sure that you stick closely to talking points and you don't leak any secrets to the outside world. And another one was the use of Communist Party study sessions inside the ministry, where you meet and you talk about Mao Zedong thought or Xi Jinping thought, and go through the latest ideological sort of copy from Xinhua and make sure that you're aligned with it. And all of these kinds of tools have kind of ebbed and flowed over the years. In the 90s and 2000s, there were periods when enforcement was relatively lax. And under Xi Jinping, there's been this incredible resurgence of focus on control and uniformity inside the foreign ministry. And so you've had, once again, diplomats sitting around in study sessions, sort of out-competing each other to get to the next level of understanding about Xi Jinping's thoughts and his ideology. And you've had incredibly strict enforcement of the buddy system as well. So in terms of what that means for China's ability to conduct diplomacy, I'd say, when that extraordinary discipline that Chinese diplomats have is taken and focused on winning friends and charming others, that it can make a great deal of progress. When it's focused on just demonstrating loyalty to Beijing and trying to prove that you're on the right side of the party leadership, then it can be really quite destructive for China's reputation. But even in those good periods, I think that this need to stick so closely to talking points, to constantly be looking over your shoulder and worried about how you're being judged and perceived inside the system, really does set a kind of upper limit on the effectiveness of Chinese diplomacy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Just a quick reminder to our audience, you can ask questions anytime by sending your questions to question, that's singular, question@fcchk.org. Question@fcchk.org. One of the things you talk about, Peter, in your book is this idea of mirror imaging, like China sort of projecting their own political systems, their own mindset, their beliefs on the rest of the world. And I think we've seen that, quite a lot in how they view the media, for example, like the way they view foreign media is, I think, somewhat akin to the way their media on the mainland operates, very differently from how, say, Bloomberg or the Washington Post operates. But how have you seen that sort of influencing their style of diplomacy and feeding into this kind of wolf warrior sort of attitude and, approach?
Yeah, so I think it's crucial. I think it's really important in terms of the way that the US and others perceive China, and then it's really important in terms of the way that they think about how our systems work too. And I guess the overriding tendency is to assume that there's a pattern and design to all kinds of activities where there's often not, right? So the big frame at the moment and for the last 5+ years has been that the US is hell-bent on containing China's rise and will do everything necessary to stop it. And so everything is interpreted through that prism. So when members of Congress speak out about human rights abuses in Xinjiang or the crackdown in Hong Kong, the assumption is that they're doing this because it's a tool that they're using to keep China down, which I think often really does a disservice to PRC diplomacy, because clearly there are members of Congress who care very deeply about those issues, quite separately from the broader issue of US-China competition. And that also applies to the way that they view foreign media reporting. Organizations must somehow be in cahoots with the CIA and the White House in terms of criticizing China and taking it apart. And I think that there is a degree of sincerity to that analysis. There is this kind of genuine misunderstanding that goes on sometimes. But I also think there are a lot of very savvy, sophisticated US hands and analysts in the Chinese foreign ministry who understand full well how these things work. But it's much easier to point the finger at reporting that you don't like, or comments that you don't like from Washington and kind of call conspiracy, than it is to say, hey, maybe we should examine this, and have we thought about altering our policies in Xinjiang, for example? That's not a very palatable thing to say internally, and so it's much easier just to go with that kind of mirror image.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I I thought your book was really impressive in how it really sketched out the arc of MOFA, right, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. From your just research and in your writing, when did you see that sort of this iteration of wolf warrior diplomacy, this very kind of shocking, very brash, sometimes even tasteless, offensive form of diplomacy start emerging? Was it quite quickly after Xi Jinping ascent to power? How would you sort of frame that against that broader arc?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was kind of it was a relatively slow build until it wasn't. So you can see elements of what we now call wolf warrior diplomacy, as I said, stretching back decades, but more recently, after the 2008 to 9 global financial crisis, you had a period of real stridency in Chinese foreign policy, whether it was from the People's Liberation Army or from diplomats. And most famously, in terms of diplomats, there was Yang Jiechi's rant in Hanoi, where he looked directly at the Singaporean representative and he said, we're a big country, you're a small country, and that's just the way things are. And that moment predated Xi Jinping, but it also spoke to this this kind of new confidence that China had after the financial crisis, where the idea was, we've weathered this better than any of you, and we have a right to speak up for our system, and we will not be lectured to. So I think, there was the financial crisis. When Xi Jinping became Communist Party boss in 2012, that kind of sense of new confidence was really galvanized and pushed across the system. And you started to see incidents where, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, had some extremely confrontational moments with his Australian counterparts, with a Canadian journalist in 2016, a moment that went viral where he really took this person to task for criticizing China's human rights record. And so this was kind of building, and it was fueled by all of these enduring insecurities that we talked about, and this new sense of confidence about China's place in the world. And what happened in 2020 was that all of those existing trends was kind of sent into high gear. And you saw, China was being severely criticized internationally for failing to curb the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic and for its alleged role in covering up its origins. And at the same time, Chinese diplomats were watching the US and Europe and countries which typically criticize Beijing over its human rights record and its foreign policy just launch into these flailing, ineffective responses to the virus. And they felt pretty vindicated about the system that they were defending. And so I think all of those trends kind of were catalyzed by the events of the coronavirus pandemic. And that's when we really saw this rush toward wolf warrior tactics.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I think has always been a question of mine, which is confidence and insecurity, right? Are these tactics a product of China's new confidence? We've emerged, we're strong, we can be like the Americans, we can be brash, we can be, offensive, or is it a product of insecurity, right? Of feeling still quite vulnerable about these criticisms, about their place in the world, about these alliances that are still pretty strong and getting stronger, obviously, including recent news with Australia and the US and the submarine deal and all of that. I mean, what do you think it is? I mean, obviously, I think it's a complicated question, and the answer is probably not that straightforward. But I'm curious to discuss that a little bit.
I really think it's a combination of the two, and that they kind of feed off each other. So like a really crystallizing moment, I thought, was when Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi sat down at Anchorage in Alaska with Secretary of State Tony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan. And Yang delivered this kind of 17-minute diatribe about how China wouldn't be spoken down to by the West, and how America was not qualified to lecture China, and he is someone who started off, in a freezing classroom in Shanghai with no heating in the winter, and kind of has come up through a system where he watched China. He was handpicked for the foreign ministry in the 1970s when China was poor, it was politically divided, its international standing was nowhere near where it's reached today, and he's watched the rise of his country, through the Olympics, through its journey to become the second biggest economy in the world, and now to a position where people talk about the entire international system being defined by this face down between two superpowers, one of which is China. And so he has an incredible amount of, I think, very genuine and in many ways justified pride about the accomplishments that China's made. But he also has this incredibly strong sense of, well, as I deliver my remarks here, Xi Jinping is going to be watching me. He's going to watch the video playback of this. My colleagues are going to talk about and report on the discussions that led up to my remarks. And so what's the safest thing for me to do as I look after my place in this system, which has, by the way, undergone a sweeping anti-corruption campaign that's punished 1.5 million officials, is locking people in re-education camps in Xinjiang, is taking down senior politicians, formerly untouchable business magnates. He's thinking about all of that stuff too, and I think the net result of that is this kind of swaggering approach to lecturing the US, and this kind of jumpy insecurity that lives alongside it, and that really does give birth to what we think of as wolf warrior diplomacy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think here in Hong Kong too, we kind of see that being mirrored, right, from also Hong Kong officials, where the system just sort of runs on its own, and then the rhetoric just kind of amplifies on top of itself, right? Because there's no incentive to sort of dial it back after it's been ratcheted up, right? Sort of related question, do you think a lot of this diplomacy, while diplomacy is actually more geared towards a domestic audience, towards how people within China perceive these remarks, and how a more sort of nationalistic country is sort of wanting to see itself on the world stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think for Chinese diplomats, domestic politics and domestic audiences are always number one. So when they deliver remarks, they're going to be thinking about, how is the central leadership going to think about this? How is the foreign ministry in Beijing going to think about this? How is my ambassador in country going to think about this? And then also, if I'm too weak or insufficiently zealous about China's achievements, how are Chinese internet users going to start to talk about my performance? And all of those things are kind of front of mind in a way that they might be considerations when US diplomats speak or European diplomats speak, but the kind of the foreign audience for Chinese diplomats is somewhere much further down the pecking order when they're thinking about what to say and how to deliver it.
Yeah. Are there any circumstances that you think this has sort of backfired in a pretty serious way for China, or actually harmed their interest?
I mean, I think taken as a whole, Chinese diplomacy has been really quite counterproductive for the entire period we would categorize as wolf warrior diplomacy. And it's kind of, I guess it's seen over the last 5 years or so, we've seen China's strengths really accentuated, this ability to win over other countries using economic inducements or coercive tactics, whether that's sanctions and boycotts, or whether it's the use of military threats. China is really good at deploying those kind of hard power incentives to shape others' behavior. It's really not as good at actually winning over hearts and minds. And that we saw that most dramatically with the simple fact that China seemed to be unable to step into that void created by the Trump administration and really take on a leadership role. There was quite a concerted push at first. You'll remember Xi Jinping's speech at Davos just before Trump's inauguration, but somehow over the years that didn't seem to gain traction. And I think what's happened is that the outside world has been, wolf warrior diplomacy is just one part of this, right? Like, China has lost constituencies across the West and in some developing countries because of its industrial policies, which upset multinational companies. Its human rights record in Xinjiang, the crackdown in Hong Kong, its militarization of the South China Sea, the list goes, and of course Xi Jinping's abolition of term limits at home and his kind of pivot away from any facade of liberalization when it comes to China's political system. All of these things have lost China's friends. And what I think wolf warrior diplomacy did was kind of put a human face on that. That all of these things were a little bit difficult to pair with these official assertions that China was a friendly country which wanted harmony in the international system and win-win cooperation. It was a little bit jarring to see those talking points together with these actions which so clearly diverged from it. And wolf warrior diplomacy just kind of put a human face on the assertiveness, if that makes sense, and I think crystallized that for a lot of people. And in that sense, it was a pretty major setback.
Yeah, we actually do have a question here, unfortunately, with no one to attribute it to, but it's a question that expands a little bit on what I just asked, which is, China culturally, prides itself on being very civilized, very, very courteous. Why would someone at the top of the party think this is a productive strategy? And when or will they realize it's counterproductive or not working as it should?
Yeah, I think that the calculation is there are kind of a couple of things going on, but the need to talk tough, I think is seen as a justified and legitimate response to efforts to vilify China and to halt its rise. And so I think on some level, and with some sincerity, Chinese diplomats believe that they're standing up to Western bullying and that they have had to listen to hectoring and lecturing from the West for decades. And now China has reached a point in its development where it doesn't need to put up with that anymore. And so they wouldn't see it, I don't think, as a break from being civilized per se. They would see it as a well-justified and probably overdue attempt to rectify that imbalance. I think at the same time, there's kind of been this, and there is this ongoing debate inside China about the role that persuasion and soft power play in any case. There are people inside the foreign ministry who think that China should continue to engage with the outside world, should try its best to persuade others of its opinions. And there are others in the foreign ministry and above their pay grade who believe that China's economic power and its military power is going to persuade others, even if it doesn't bother to kind of coax them or to be polite about it. And I remember having a conversation with a Chinese official before I left Beijing, and this person basically said that there are people inside the system who believe that China can purchase goodwill and it doesn't need to kind of kowtow to others as it rises. And I think that is probably a view that's shared by Xi Jinping and lots of people in his inner circle, and some people inside MOFA. And those who disagree don't feel empowered to speak out.
And how did you view that more assertive diplomacy during the pandemic? Did it actually help China get away from this idea that obviously it originated from Wuhan, and there was some culpability there, and obviously the whole situation with the WHO and the opacity, right, that we're still dealing with when it comes to the origins of the virus. Do you think it was effective in kind of repositioning China as a sort of savior with the vaccine diplomacy and outreach, especially within the Asian region, or do you think it's sort of also been counterproductive?
I mean, I think it's been largely counterproductive. It's a little bit like I said earlier. Some of China's strengths have been highlighted: its ability to use its supply chains to produce massive amounts of vaccine and personal protective equipment, and to ship those around the world. Kind of plays to a strength of the Chinese system, but it's paired with this insistence that once that aid is received, countries must be publicly grateful to Beijing, and they should keep quiet about issues over which they might disagree. And so that has kind of accentuated this idea that China just acts like a bully. And then I think that the kind of high volume, sometimes even kind of shrill approach to accusations that China might have taken wrong steps early on in the pandemic has done nothing to dissuade outsiders from the idea that there needs to be a very thorough look into the origins of COVID. Certainly it was when Australia called for an international investigation into the origins of the pandemic. I think that the level of vitriol and anger from China only served to persuade onlookers that there was something to dig around for, rather than persuade people that they should kind of stand down and stop looking.
Mm-hmm. A reminder again to our audience: you can send questions at question@fcchk.org. We have another question here from Mark Mitchelson. The question is, could you discuss the role and impact of wolf warrior diplomats in the Xinjiang cotton controversy?
I guess for issues like Xinjiang, and actually in the virus is a little bit similar, the foreign ministry's role is to read aloud statements which are provided to it by other ministries and officials. The room for policy making from Chinese diplomats is really incredibly limited, right? Like China's policies in Xinjiang have come from the Politburo and with blessing from Xi Jinping. And so when very early on reports emerged that there were re-education camps in Xinjiang, the official line inside the system was that these camps didn't exist, and that there was kind of nothing to see here. It was all conspiracy theory. And so MOFA spokespeople responded when asked by journalists. I was at some of these briefings, when they were asked about re-education camps, they would say, these are rumors, they're slander against China, and I've never heard of any such thing as re-education camps. Within months of that happening, the official line had changed to China has an extraordinary program for dealing with radical Islamists, which includes a network of vocational training centers, which should become the envy of the world and a model for others to emulate. And the kind of complete about face between those two positions was, I think, a result of decisions which were taken way above the pay grade of people at MOFA, and it was a decision that China had got a correct set of policies and was willing to vigorously defend them in public. And I think that MOFA officials were kind of left with their heads spinning a little bit, trying to defend these almost sort of polar opposite opinions in public in such short succession. But that's the nature of their job under Xi Jinping.
Yeah. One of the things I find pretty interesting is that, you see a lot of this wolf warrior style diplomacy manifest itself on Twitter, right? Where, Chinese diplomats are responding even to people with like no followers, and, sort of random kind of bot accounts. Obviously the I can't breathe comment, the Hua Chunying one that was pretty, eye-raising, especially in the United States. What do you make of Chinese diplomats, turning to social media, especially American social media platforms, which are banned inside of China, but using those platforms to kind of get their message across to a much more lay audience, right? Because then you're not just talking about diplomats, you're not talking about high-level interactions there, you're talking about bringing that wolf warrior style diplomacy and messaging directly to, Western, American, and other consumers, right?
Yeah, so I think that the Twitter phenomenon is really fascinating, not least because the foreign ministry was incredibly late to the party when it came to to using Twitter. The State Council Information Office had been earlier had embraced it much earlier, as had Chinese state media outlets. And I think that in many ways it was Zhao Lijian, the one of the current MOFA spokespeople, who kind of led the way in using the platform. And what Zhao's behavior showed, I think, was that this was a way to get noticed in Beijing. He famously picked a Twitter fight with former National Security Advisor Susan Rice, which kind of catapulted him to fame in China and showed the Chinese public, many of whom had been looking out for an official to speak out against American criticism in this way, to show that there were diplomats out there who were willing to do it. And then inside the Chinese system, he was rewarded with this job as spokesperson, which made him one of the most high-profile Chinese officials, not just in the foreign ministry, but in the whole of the Chinese government, and really was a path that he hadn't been on before. He was a South Asia expert, not a public affairs person. And so, I think what it's done is, for diplomats like him, but also people who are posted in Fiji and Venezuela and places where they might not get that much attention from the party center, it's provided them a way to signal back to the center that they too are loyal to the Xi Jinping project. And I think it's important to remember that even though Twitter itself is banned, many of these exchanges are reported in Chinese state media, and certainly the activities of Chinese diplomats on Twitter will be reported back to MOFA as part of their standard kind of reporting procedures of Chinese diplomats. And so while it often seems like the primary audience is foreign, I think it's much more a case of trying to signal to Beijing that the individuals are taking the right approach and are on board with Xi's goals. I guess just one sort of final thing that I would add is that the uptake of Twitter in some ways is the most confusing and almost paradoxical part of wolf warrior diplomacy, simply because it seems so antithetical to the rest of the Xi Jinping project. When you look at the way that Xi Jinping has tried to remake the party state, it's all about responsiveness to the rule of the CCP, whether that's in industrial policy or foreign policy or the way that the military works. It's about making sure that every institution in the party state responds to the party center's orders, and making sure that the party center in turn responds to the wishes of Xi himself. And so it's not clear to me why that system would allow a significant role for freelancing diplomats making up their own talking points on Twitter. And it's been my feeling for a little while that we're likely to see some kind of moderation of that. Maybe we've already started to see it. It's kind of hard to tell. Probably not a softening in tone. I think Xi Jinping likes the tough tone, but maybe a little bit more uniformity of messaging when it comes to unleashing on social media.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because obviously that approach makes them sort of personalities in their own right? They become like, you mentioned Zhao Lijian, like they become known for a certain style. They become sort of iconic, right, in a way. And I mean, I think that's one really interesting thing about wolf warrior diplomacy. It seems like a lot of these Chinese diplomats have moved from being this like generic Chinese diplomat to sort of personalities in and of itself. I mean, do you see that as one of the major changes, right, from the from the early times of Zhou Enlai? Because I noticed in your book you quote a lot from and read a lot of memoirs of Chinese diplomats, way back when, and I think that whole style and that shift to me seems like one of the most interesting things that you kind of explored in your book.
I mean, I think I see it as kind of old tactics, new platforms. You alluded to the earlier history of China's diplomatic corps, and in similar ways, in the 60s, there were diplomats who acted out overseas, getting into literal fights with foreigners on the streets of London, handing out copies of Mao's Little Red Book, decorating Chinese embassies with the sayings of Mao Zedong, and acting in really quite provocative ways, some of which got Chinese diplomats expelled from foreign countries. And I think that they were engaged in some ways in quite a similar set of tactics. This was a highly risky political environment where you might be criticized from any side for being insufficiently loyal to Mao, and not a good enough revolutionary. And these people were trying to signal to Beijing, I'm on board with this, even if my ambassador isn't. And oftentimes saw ways to get promoted by doing quite heinous things, up to and including beating up Chinese ambassadors until they coughed up blood, and all kinds of terrible antics. And clearly the tactics are different now, right? Like, it's about showing off on social media or shouting at foreigners or storming out of meetings. But I think that the aim is often pretty similar, and so I see a lot of continuity there.
Interesting. So looking forward a little bit, do you expect this kind of approach and tech to continue? I mean, obviously we've had a shift in Washington, where the whole Trump administration sort of flamboyance and off the cuff remarks and unpredictable ambassadors sort of waned, and with it has come a much more predictable environment, right, in Washington. But obviously at the same time, those tension points between US and China still exist, right, and if anything have continued in quite a, you mentioned the meeting in Anchorage. That was, I think, a key example of that, right? But how do you see that kind of diplomacy and wolf warrior style going forward, and how do you see it in relation to where we're at right now more broadly with US China?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in some ways I see them quite separately. If you look at the extent of where wolf warrior tactics have been used most, it's countries like Canada, Australia, France, the UK, and India, as well as a swathe of smaller developing countries that have really felt the brunt of it. And I think that that's to do with Chinese officials feeling empowered to speak out in those places and not really fearing the consequences too much of those governments turning against Beijing. There's always been more moderation in terms of the way that China and Chinese diplomats approach the United States. And of course, there are these high-profile examples like the Anchorage meeting, or like Zhao Lijian's use of Twitter to pick fights with former officials. But in general, I think Beijing is still very cognizant of the fact that the US economy is bigger than China's, that the US has the most advanced military forces in the world, and that China's prosperity and stability and security are all intimately, tied to its ability to maintain good relations with the US. And I think you can see that a little bit actually in the way that the new ambassador Qin Gang has conducted himself. There's been some reporting about Qin uses X speech to go full wolf warrior in Washington. I haven't really seen that at all. I think his tone has been relatively measured when you compare it against, foreign ministry spokespeople's remarks, or the speeches of top leaders. It seems to me to be really quite in the current vein of what's acceptable. And when it comes to US-China relations more generally, I think that you can see the Chinese government trying to figure out what's next. There's this talking point they've been using for a while. Yang used it in Anchorage, Wang Yi used it in a speech, Qin Gang has repeated it recently, which is the Trump administration wrecked our relationship, and the US behaved very, very badly during that time. But China was watching closely and exercised great restraint. And if you're ready to come back to the table and make amends for your bad behavior, then we'd be happy to pick up where we left off at the end of the Obama administration. That's the kind of go-to talking point right now. And I think it's pretty clear that that's not working. And there are some, I think, quite sincere hurt feelings on the Chinese side. If you talk to officials about how that pitch has kind of been responded to, it's been quite directly rebuffed by the Biden administration, and Beijing is trying to figure out why that might be. The problem and I think that there are some people, probably including Xi Jinping, who would like to see the relationship repaired and brought back to stability. The key problem is that the sources of US-China tensions are so much more deeply ingrained and go so far beyond just messaging and tactics and wolf warrior diplomacy. It's also about Chinese economic policies, China's approach to foreign affairs, the centralization of China's political system, the rise of the cult of personality of Xi Jinping, and all of these things I think would need to be addressed in some way if relations were to improve. And there is pretty much zero sign that Xi Jinping is focused on actually changing tack when it comes to those policies. And so even if wolf warrior diplomacy were to be kind of tapered a little bit, I find it really hard to see how that would translate into a fundamental improvement in ties.
Yeah. How do you see sort of Chinese state media kind of fitting into the broader, diplomatic kind of approach? Obviously, the Global Times in particular had a lot of very strong op-eds and cartoons and so on after the Afghanistan exit withdrawal, right? Including those alluding to Taiwan, and seemed to be sort of kind of an extension of what MOFA had been messaging. But do you see this as sort of separate, linked, or?
I guess I see them as complementary, but probably not deeply coordinated. The Chinese propaganda system reports directly to the Communist Party. Doesn't flow through the same state institutions that the foreign ministry does. And so I think what we see is Chinese propaganda outlets, Chinese state media outlets mimicking Xi Jinping's tough tone when it comes to international affairs, and then separately we see the foreign ministry doing the same. And occasionally there's probably a little bit of coordination, but I think more importantly than that, the kind of general pattern is that everyone plays to what they believe that Xi Jinping wants to see, whether that's state media or whether it's Chinese diplomats.
Slight tangent, but Ian here had a question, which is not exactly about Wolf Warrior, but since you spent so much time covering Chinese politics, what do you make of Xi's common prosperity drive over, the last month, and what do you think drives it, and where do you think it's heading?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been based on the ground in Beijing for more than a year. The best take I've heard from sort of talking to smart people about it is that this is perhaps part of a run-up to Xi Jinping securing a third term as China's president. Not so much Xi seeking support for himself, but lower level regulators starting to guess at some of the policy priorities he might want to pursue in a third term and kind of overzealously implementing them and pushing those things as far as they can in an attempt to show that they are capable of delivering on Xi's wishes, almost preemptively, and actually a little bit like the way that the Wolf Warrior phenomenon works too. So it's like it's a new drive from Xi, which responds to the deep-seated fears that inequality and social injustice might undo CCP legitimacy, and then it's also kind of a bidding war from lower level officials to show that they are capable of implementing those wishes beyond Xi's wildest dreams, and in an attempt to kind of further their own careers. That's kind of one of the most interesting pieces of analysis I've seen put out there. It's not my own argument, but I think that's kind of worth paying attention to.
It really seems to me that like a theme of this whole conversation is that with a system like China's and with a party like the Chinese Communist Party, there are just so few tools and mechanisms to self-correct when something has gone in a certain direction. It's very hard to sort of rein back and take stock and figure out whether this is working or not. I mean, would you say that has been something that sort of come up with your sort of reporting and research in the book and otherwise?
Well, so I think one of the hallmarks when you look at the Chinese system over a longer period of time is this extraordinary ability to veer off course and then to course correct. And sometimes that happens in circumstances where it's not at all obvious to the outside world that a rethink is going on in Beijing. The most dramatic example, of course, is the invitation of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon to Beijing in the 70s, and this almost unthinkable pivot toward America by the world's second largest communist country. Another spectacularly successful example was in the aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre, China's ability to kind of set aside territorial disputes to focus on opening up its economy and to exercise great restraint in its foreign policy and diplomacy in a way that would help to rehabilitate Beijing's image. And I don't think that the Nixon pivot was obvious to people kind of in the years before it happened, and I don't think that Tiananmen charm offensive would have been easy to predict in the fall of 1989, and yet these things happened. And I think one of the things that's really puzzled a lot of China watchers in the last few years is the fact that there's been such a robust and widespread backlash to Xi Jinping's policies, and yet there doesn't seem to have been any kind of recalibration of his approach. And so, there was this Politburo study session earlier in the summer where Xi talked about the need for China to cultivate a more lovable image. and to be respected internationally, and that kind of seemed to hint at the idea that Xi understood that there has been a backlash which has real costs for China. The problem, as I said earlier, is that there doesn't seem to have been any policy recalibration that's gone together with that rethink about messaging. It seems to really just be a matter of taking China's existing policies and weaving a better story around them. And I don't think that's going to cut it.
Mm-hmm. So we've just 5 minutes left. I'm going to ask a question that we ask all our guests. What are you currently reading that is not your book? And do you have any recommendations for our guests?
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to kind of get up to speed on my new beat in Washington and learn a little bit about military stuff. And so I guess I've really been enjoying everything I've read by Thomas Ricks, who wrote this amazing book about the U.S. Marine Corps called Making the Corps. He wrote a couple of really great books about the Iraq War and America's misadventures in the Middle East, and everything that I come across of his is super fun and informative, and just extraordinarily well crafted and put together in a way that makes me very, very jealous. So that would be my recommendation.
And like super final question, just because you mentioned Washington, what do you think the mood is in DC now when it comes to China? How is China in this moment being sort of perceived, and what do you think do you think there's a consensus on how to deal with Beijing and sort of what comes next?
Yeah, people squabble over semantics of whether there's a consensus or not, because in any place like this, clearly there's a huge variety of different views. But I think that the general idea that I don't know quite how to put it, if people in Washington were a kind of 5 out of 10 in terms of being angry about China in 2015, they're a 7 or an 8 out of 10 now on average. Just kind of the center point of where the China debate has transformed quite dramatically, and I don't really see any way for it to go back. And that's reflected in people like Eli Ratner, Rush Doshi, Kurt Campbell, people who would have once been considered relatively hawkish on China issues now have very prominent roles in the Biden administration and are shaping the US's approach. One thing that I've kind of noticed on a much more granular level here is how ineffective informal communication with the PRC has become. Part of that is to do with Xi Jinping's crackdown on people speaking out in public or in track 2 dialogues with former officials. People stick incredibly closely to talking points and really don't provide any information on Beijing's thinking beyond that which you'd get from officials publicly. Part of it is the fact that because of COVID, in-person dialogues of that type can't happen, and so there's no kind of off-the-record coffee table discussion where people can put forward their own views and kind of signal a change in approach. And so what I think is striking is how far people here are reliant on official PRC talking points, right? Which, as we all know, are incredibly difficult to decipher and sometimes very misleading when it comes to understanding true thinking in Beijing. But that we're at a point now where it's very, very difficult to get beyond those, and I don't think that bodes well for the relationship.
Great. Well, super interesting conversation. Again, Peter's book is called China's Civilian Army: The Making of Wolf Warrior Diplomacy. get on Kindle. It's going to be out in the UK in a couple of weeks. And thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. And yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.